Even before the referendum in 2016, supporters of Great Britain's exit from the European Union promised sovereignty, control over borders, economic strengthening, and a reduction in bureaucracy. Opponents, on the other hand, warned of recession, investor flight, and isolation on the international stage. Nearly a decade has passed since Britons voted in favour of Brexit. Today, one can ask the question, was this the beginning of the fall of one of Europe's most important countries? Great Britain's economy in the years preceding the referendum was one of the fastest growing in Europe. The country attracted investors, was a financial hub, and London was regarded as the capital of global finance. From the moment the Brexit decision was announced, the pound sterling's exchange rate significantly dropped, which impacted inflation and citizens' purchasing power. Imported goods became more expensive, and inflation reached levels not seen for over a dozen years. In the first years after leaving the European Union, economic growth was noticeably lower than in other developed countries. According to data from the International Monetary Fund, Great Britain in 2023 had one of the lowest growth rates among the G7 countries. Private investments declined, and many companies from the financial and technology sectors relocated their offices to Dublin, Amsterdam, or Frankfurt. Not only the private sector felt the effects of Brexit. Agriculture and the food industry also faced logistical problems and labour shortages. Leaving the single market meant the necessity of customs clearances, sanitary controls, and bureaucratic barriers, which slowed down trade. Small and medium-sized enterprises particularly acutely felt the increased costs of exports and imports. Another challenge became the labour market. Great Britain, previously benefiting from the influx of workers from Central Eastern Europe, began to struggle with a shortage of labour. This especially affected the healthcare, hospitality, agriculture, and transport sectors. In 2022, many farmers were forced to destroy crops due to a lack of hands for harvesting. One of the most visible effects of Brexit is the weakening of Great Britain's position on the international stage. Although the country remains a member of NATO and maintains close relations with Washington, it no longer directly participates in EU decisions regarding trade, technology, or financial regulations. The European Union is deepening internal cooperation, and Great Britain is increasingly left out of key initiatives, such as joint industrial policy or investments in green transformation. Brexit also deepened internal tensions. In Scotland, the debate over independence reignited, and in Northern Ireland, fears of a return to instability emerged. The Irish Protocol, which was intended to ensure no hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, in practice created a customs administrative barrier within the United Kingdom. This caused dissatisfaction among some Unionists and affected the political stability of the region. On a societal level, an increase in uncertainty and frustration was noted. The younger generation, which largely voted to remain in the European Union, feels limitations in access to education, the labour market, and exchange programs like Erasmus. Social divisions between regions, social classes, and generations also grew. Despite these problems, Great Britain is attempting to redefine its position in the world. The government promotes the concept of Global Britain, which assumes the development of trade relations outside Europe, particularly with India, Australia, or the United States. New trade agreements have been signed, and in 2023 the country joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The question remains, will these initiatives suffice to compensate for the loss of the EU market? In the next part, we will take a closer look at macroeconomic data, the effects on the real estate market, public finances, as well as societal and political reactions. Are we truly dealing with a fall? Or is this merely a transitional crisis related to redefining the country's role on the global stage? Great Britain, since the referendum in 2016, has undergone a profound economic, political, and social transformation. Although many Brexit supporters promised regaining control, sovereignty, and new trade opportunities, the reality turned out to be far more complicated. For the average Briton, this means lower economic growth, rising prices, greater social tensions, and the question, was it really worth it? One of the main problems Great Britain faces is the rising cost of servicing public debt. Public debt has exceeded 100% of gross domestic product, meaning the country must allocate an ever larger portion of budget revenues to interest payments alone. According to data from the Office for Budget Responsibility, Great Britain currently spends more on debt servicing than on funding the military. This situation limits the government's room for maneuver and prevents investments in infrastructure, education, or energy transformation. At the same time, the weakening of the British pound since the referendum made imported goods more expensive. The rise in inflation, which accelerated after the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, was particularly felt in Great Britain. Food inflation exceeded several percent, and the average household now spends significantly more on basic products. Real wage growth has not kept up with inflation, deepening the cost of living crisis. Brexit also had a significant impact on the labour market. Labour shortages, particularly in sectors such as transport, logistics, healthcare, or agriculture, are a direct consequence of restricting labour migration from the European Union. Many entrepreneurs complain about a lack of workers, which leads to reduced production and increased operating costs. Workers who remained demand higher wages, which in turn contributes to inflationary pressure. It is also worth looking at the situation of small and medium-sized enterprises, which suffered the most due to the introduction of trade barriers with the European Union. Bureaucracy, new customs regulations, border controls, and increased logistics costs made exports to the EU less profitable. According to a report from the British Federation of Small Businesses, over 35% of companies reduced export activities or completely withdrew from them. The structural transformation also affected the financial sector. Although London remains one of the world's most important financial centers, many companies moved part of their operations to Paris, Frankfurt, or Amsterdam to maintain access to the EU's single market. The loss of thousands of jobs and a decline in foreign investments are clear signals that Great Britain's attractiveness as a financial hub has been weakened. In the political sphere, tensions between the central government and the regions are growing. Scotland is increasingly vocal about demanding a second independence referendum, citing the fact that the majority of Scots voted to remain in the European Union. The implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol leads to social and political tensions as it creates a regulatory border in the Irish Sea. In the long term, this could lead to a loosening of the Union and further internal division. Despite these challenges, Great Britain is attempting to redefine its role on the international stage. New trade agreements with Australia, Japan, or India are intended to counterbalance the loss of the EU market. However, analyses show that none of these agreements compensate for the losses resulting from restricted trade with the European Union. Experts point out that Great Britain gained theoretical independence but lost influence over regulations that still affect it, though it no longer has a say in them. Ultimately, the question of whether Brexit was a success remains open. For some, it is a symbol of sovereignty. For others, the beginning of a long-term weakening of Great Britain's position in the world. Economic indicators, demographic data, and social sentiments leave no illusions. The United Kingdom faces its toughest test since the Second World War. Will it manage to rebuild investor confidence, restore economic growth, and maintain the country's unity? The answer to this question depends on the decisions made today.